Alice in Borderland has got to be one of my favorite shows of all time, mainly because of the cool cinematography and storyline. But there were some unanswered questions that everyone was confused about. I think it's because Season 2 only had 8 episodes to cover everything. It obviously deviated from its manga, but even if the ending was satisfying, I still wonder what exactly is Borderland.
おい
Technically speaking, the show's ending did connect the dots of how Arisu and others got there, but it doesn't say much about what the mysterious place is really like. During the final game, when the Queen of Hearts is trying to play with Arisu, she tells lies that confuse and distract the audience. But here's the deal. The Borderland is a kind of purgatory world in the manga, where the survivors of the Tokyo meteor crash decide their fate based on how much they want to live. But in the show, that doesn't explain why the Borderland looks too much like Tokyo and why all the sci-fi stuff has to happen. They didn't even clear up the physical rules of the Borderland. Possibly because, again, it's hard to say exactly what the Borderland is. Viewers know that some people live in relative comfort there, especially permanent residents. But if that's really the case, where and how do they get the things they need to live? Because if you see, the whole place isn't really a functioning society.
何もゲームが始まらない
Plus, the show never had time to show how the people who lived in the Borderland all the time did well. It also didn't say how they set up their expensive and complicated games. And let's say if they do have metaphysical powers, or can change the way things are, then why are they also limited by their bodies? Also, if you remember Season 1, you might probably remember the surveillance center place.
おめでとうプレイヤーの諸君
Where was that in Season 2? At the end of the first season, Arisu, Usagi, and the beach survivors found a huge surveillance center in the Borderland. Interestingly, that kept track of all the games. But sad to say, Season 2 never really built on this idea. The building made it seem like the game masters didn't work alone, and might have even needed help from their games. But with all the cutting-edge technology around them, especially the super accurate death lasers, it's fair to say that Borderlands' manual security cameras were definitely a step backwards. I mean, whoever was in charge of those lasers probably didn't even need to keep an eye on them, but that's also where they missed a plot hole about the residents. The people who live in Borderland are also interesting, and they've raised a lot of questions. Like, what did they have to gain if they stayed? Do they keep putting their lives at risk every time a new group of tourists come? Because if you watch the whole series, you'll realize that the people who were watching the game and were killed were likely also residents. At the end of Season 2, the fans were told that people who died in Borderland also died in the actual world. While those who lived and chose to go back, they were able to recover from their cardiac arrest in the real world. But what about the people living there? It's easy to think that if they stayed in the Borderland, their dead bodies in the real world would also die. But that's the thing, the show never really talked about that. And I've got a personal theory that the people who live in the Borderland could be in a coma. But that makes me wonder, who was the King of Spades? And why was he the only one allowed to cheat? In the first episode of Season 2, the King of Spades showed up. That too with a lot of noise and blood after shooting dozens of people. But they never really went into why he was allowed to do this kind of ambush, and without explaining the rules and limits first, because the other face card games had to do this. That also makes me think about who makes the rules for games in Borderland. Because if you think about it, it's impossible for the citizens to build those game sets on their own, considering the random shootings and unlimited supplies. guys. And so far, the game from King of Spades was the most unfair, but for some reason, the Borderlands owner let it happen. Why? But here's an interesting Easter egg if you didn't know. Arisu is basically Alice. I mean, his name kind of gives it away, but in the beginning, when he gets caught up in a video game and has to snap out of it, there's a hint of what's yet to come. In Borderland, well, that game becomes a reality for the players. Speaking of which, the Borderland is always empty and looks like it's after the end of the world, except when it's showing off game areas in Game Masters. If you remember, the game areas were in great shape, and they had equipment and facilities that made many modern sports centers look bad. The question is, who makes these games and the materials they need in a world with so little order and authority?
大量発生。あなたたちも見たでしょ？街がどんどん植物に覆われていたのを。
Also, why did the owner of Borderland use a deck of cards and party games to test the people? One could argue that the Borderland was just a shared fever dream, and that what happened there didn't really matter. But if that's true, Arisu wouldn't have been able to get over the death of his friends so quickly. That reminds me, what was the deal with the Joker card? At the end of the series, there was a shot of the Joker card, and also a change in the music that made it sound scary, and it's not clear what the showrunners plan to do with this. Also, in the manga, the Joker is some kind of god who runs the Borderland, and he makes deals with the people who live there and the people who run the games. Even Arisu talked to him, but the Netflix version didn't include this exchange from the manga, so it's hard to tell what the Joker card means in the show. Most likely, they need another season or a movie to unpack all of that. And because I was curious, I did some digging on whether the series will have season 3. But sadly, there have been no announcements on if the show will continue. Season 2 took its time because of the pandemic, but I feel like the 3rd season could come out in late 2023. That's if all goes well. And even though a year is still a long time, I'm not taking the word early very seriously, because if you want the best production, you shouldn't rush these things. And honestly, I'm quite hopeful about it. I mean, there's so much left to explain in Season 3, especially now that Season 2 ended at the hospital scene. I'm wondering if it's another version of reality that hasn't been introduced yet. And hey, there's a lot more to see of surprise visitors, aka Naragi and Aguni. They made it out alive in Season 2, so they'll definitely be in Season 3. But I can't say the same for Tuta. I'll miss him the most from Season 2, to be honest. I think it was because he was buried halfway through the season. I'm sure he won't come back to life. Also, side note, but I can't wait to see more of Chishia's cool looks. And yeah, that's all the unanswered questions from Alice in Borderland I can think of. See you in the next one.